20 registered supporters. Is it possible China will invade, occupy and/or annex Australian territory? To answer this question, we will consider the following. 1. Who is the Chinese government? 2. What drives Chinese government policy? 3. How does the Chinese government control its citizens? 4. Will it covet Australian territory? 5. Will it be able to occupy Australian territory? And 6. If so, how might Chinese annexation of Australian territory proceed? So, who is the Chinese government? When Mao was at his peak, China was a dictatorship. After Mao, China reverted to authoritarianism, which involves a sharing of power amongst a select elite. Now, under President Xi Jinping, it has once again become a dictatorship, which effectively means Xi Jinping is the Chinese government. So, what is motivating the president? The driver behind Chinese government policy. Doesn't Xi Jinping resemble a giant panda? Isn't this curiously coincidental given pandas are China's national symbol? And regarding Xi Jinping, doesn't he also seem to possess a panda's docility? However, obviously that charm is misleading and he is hardly harmless. After all, invariably a dictator's, even a benevolent one's, greatest motivation is self-preservation. And regarding self-preservation, a dictator must get someone's hands dirty. Regarding the Chinese president, a quick run through his resume includes the following. 1. Thousands of political prisoners, less because many are executed or otherwise die in jail. 2. The continued perennial stoking of hatred towards Japan. Yes, the correct word is hatred. For instance, as well as anti-Japanese sentiment being ingrained in the Chinese education system, anti-Japanese propaganda movies and series are constantly, ubiquitously running on Chinese television. 3. The just as perennial Tibet and Dalai Lama issue, even in the face of the spate of self-immolations. 4. Xinjiang and the recent imprisonment of up to 1 million Uyghurs. 5. In the South China Sea, the breaking of international law with the construction of militarised bases and attempts to restrict freedom of navigation and of flight. 6. The growing overt threat to Taiwan. 7. Their unconscionable support for North Korea. 8. China's quickly growing, advancing and distance projecting military. 9. Their advancement into the Pacific and Indian Oceans and so-called depth trap diplomacy. So, Xi Jinping's apparent docility is actually more likely to be nonchalance. That is, with an invisible wave of his hand, the South China Sea is annexed, or 1 million Uyghurs put in jail, or perhaps Taiwan invaded, and then who knows. Accordingly, whether it's human rights, international law, or the average Chinese citizen, Xi Jinping, all are subsumed beneath his and his government's supreme priority of self-preservation. And that self-preservation depends on his ability to control Chinese citizens. How does the Chinese government control its citizens? The Chinese government's control of Chinese citizens consists of 3 strategies. 1. Controlling and manipulating Chinese citizens' thoughts and activities. 2. Distracting, particularly by stoking nationalism. And 3. Enticing people to focus on bettering their own material circumstances. Regarding controlling and manipulating Chinese citizens' thoughts and activities, this is achieved through 1. The formal education sector, via systematically controlling the content, i.e. mind-washing, and even more insidiously, systematically restricting the base ability to think, so that mind underdevelopment is induced. That is, by eliminating controversies from discussion, they create a contradiction vacuum where there is nothing to independently and critically analyse. For example, even at tertiary level, they don't discuss controversies such as abortion or Taiwan or anything else. They just learn what the teacher tells them, and the teacher is invariably monitored by classroom video, and in any case will be reported if they overstep. 2. There is control over what kinds of groups can meet and how many people can meet. 3. Control of the internet, the great firewall of China, blocking Google, even Gmail, and controlling social media, including blocking Facebook. This control constitutes a massive, continuous, ubiquitous cost to the economy, as either one must use a virtual protocol network, a VPN, which is slow and may continually drop out. Every working day it may cost 1 to 2 hours in extra time. or one must use, for instance, instead of Google, the vastly inferior Baidu. And 4, there is a relatively new social credit score system. Perhaps this is the most diabolical scheme yet. If you don't know of it, you may wish to look it up. Regarding stoking nationalism, nationalism is by far the Chinese government's greatest distraction. The Chinese people absolutely lap it up. The 5,000 years of culture, the Middle Kingdom status, and on it goes. Just say to a Chinese person, you want to know about Chinese history, then settle back. Make sure your chair is comfortable. Of course, Xi Jinping and his supporters paint the Communist Party and therefore themselves in terms of being the guardians of Chinese culture. In addition, they use nationalism to stoke militarism, including regarding 1. Japan, which extends into racism against the Japanese people and includes the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands dispute. 2. The South China Sea expansion. 3. Taiwan. Regarding enticing people to focus on bettering their own material circumstances, this depends on ensuring the economy continues expanding. Economic expansion. The Chinese elite are well aware economic calamity brought the Soviet Communist Party down, which led to the Soviet Union's disintegration, and thus it also almost resulted in the Chinese Communist Party's collapse. This shock still resounds to the point of terrifying them. They are also very well aware and very well educated on how economic collapse led to the fall of Indonesia's Suharto, who in some ways Xi Jinping is reminiscent of. Thus, they are desperate to keep their economy expanding. However, while in 2007, China's GDP growth rate was 14.2%, in 2018, it had dropped to a maximum of just 6.6%, less than half. Even though their GDP per capita is still only about 15% of that of Australia's. I repeat, their income per person is less than 1/6 of an Australian's. Thus, since they are still a catch-up economy, they could and should still be growing by around 10% per annum. However, notwithstanding resorting to systematised computer hacking, intellectual property theft, and coercion of companies who wish to sell to the enormous Chinese market, the reason expanding the economy is becoming vastly more difficult is in large part due to the requirement for a more educated and critical thinking labour force, which has access to an optimal internet and exists within a merit-based free economy. Of course, this contradicts their other self-preservation policies. Accordingly, even withstanding the productiveness of the Chinese work ethic, it is likely they will reach a ceiling reasonably soon. Regarding other Asian nations that were authoritarian and became democracies, the Chinese GDP per capita far exceeds the level of Japan, South Korea and Taiwan when they switched, which implies it's only by the Chinese authorities ever tightening the lid that they have thus far staved off revolution. So, they have a very dangerous dilemma. They need to keep their economy booming in order to keep their citizens happy. However, the greater their GDP per capita, the harder this is to achieve without allowing freedoms that will contradict the entire reason the government wants a booming economy, namely self-preservation. Meanwhile, the more the economy needs freedom to flourish and the more the citizens demand freedom, including as a result of their experiences studying, living and travelling in the West, the more the authorities need to clamp down in order to prevent it. Thus, if the economy continues to slow from its current 6.6%, then self-preservation will likely lead to a need for distractions. So, how may Australia figure in all this? Does Xi Jinping covet the annexation of Australian territory? First, given Xi Jinping's mistreatment of his own citizens, he is unlikely to bear goodwill towards Australians and Australia. And by gaining Australian territory, he potentially achieves 4 outcomes. 1. Stokes Chinese nationalism. 2. Takes a chess piece off the board. That is, it prevents Australia interfering in other issues including the South China Sea and the Pacific, particularly Australia's traditional sphere of influence, the South Pacific, which China also covers. 3. Gain the resources it needs to keep its economy pumping without, provided the US doesn't intervene, very much cost. And 4. Antarctica. Regarding Australia's resource and environmental attributes, we are almost perfect complements. That is, we have all that which they need. Space, resources, food, clean environment, and a tremendous geopolitical location which commands the Indian Ocean, the South Pacific Ocean, and the Southern or Antarctic Ocean. Regarding evidence of Australia possessing what the Middle Kingdom wants, while most countries run a trade deficit with China, Australia runs the second largest trade surplus, which is behind only South Korea. Regarding Antarctica and its coast, it is a massive, pristine, resource-rich region. And not only does China not recognise any country's claims over any part of Antarctica, Australia and Australian claims to it lie in East Asia's, i.e. China's, longitudinal sector. Regarding China's Antarctic research bases, the first was established on British claimed territory in 1985. However, since then they've opened 3 bases on Australian claimed territory in 1989, 2009 and 2014. And now they are building their 5th just to the east in New Zealand claimed territory. By contrast, Australia has only 3 bases. And with Tasmania, the gateway base to the Antarctic, in 2014, Xi Jinping made a very unusual special visit to the Apple Isle where he was greeted by a Chinese icebreaker. In sum, certainly there are significant people in the Chinese government military who believe and aspire that one day some of Australia's territories, if not Australia per se, will be Chinese. Will China be able to occupy Australian territory? Whether or not China could occupy Australian territory depends on 3 factors. 1. Could it persuade the Chinese people to invade all or part of Australia? 2. Does China or will China vis-a-vis Australia have the necessary military capacity? 3. What would the US do? While it couldn't persuade all Chinese people, under certain circumstances, particularly manufactured ones, the Chinese government could persuade or corral enough. Apart from our limited forces and perhaps 2,000 US soldiers in Darwin, we are relatively ripe for the asking, for the taking, especially if threatened by missiles and nuclear-powered submarines. Regarding the US, as its military superiority diminishes, it is also withdrawing. The US has many interests and can no longer achieve them all, which means it must prioritise. Note, it did nothing to stop Russia's annexations in northern Georgia and eastern Ukraine, and has been humiliated by Kim Jong-un. How might invasion proceed? Invasion could start with any excuse. For instance, 1. The South China Sea or another international issue. 2. A dispute regarding the Chinese leased Darwin port. 3. A dispute over some other commercial agreement, perhaps involving a Chinese resource or farming entity. 4. The Chinese wishing to mine or fish in Antarctica, etc. With Australia's mines, farms and pit stops to Antarctica all relatively remote to the vast majority of city-dwelling Australians, the template could well follow Russia's recent annexations. That is, a compromise invasion. For example, they could insist on unimpeded access to northern Australia's major mines, farms and transport links, including ports. In addition, or alternatively, there is Tasmania and Antarctica. Regarding Tasmania/Antarctica, they could sail in, take over, and then say, we will send all the Tasmanians to the mainland, and provided you don't resist, we'll leave you alone. If it happened, what could Australia do about it? So, is this likely to happen within the next 5 to 10 years? No. However, during that period, Taiwan quite possibly has a problem. Is Australia likely to have a problem during the next 10 to 20 years, when the Chinese economy may be up to 4 times as large as it is presently? Perhaps, which means we need to start getting our country's systems in order now, so that we are ready. If we are adequately prepared, then nothing will happen, and everyone will say we wasted our money and effort. Anyway, what's all this got to do with the citizens' dividend? In general, the best way to counteract external threats is to be internally as strong as possible, which means getting our socio-economic system in order, which the citizens' dividend will dramatically assist. For example, under the current high minimum wage system, we lost the entire car industry. Thus, The implementation of the minimum wage abolishing citizens' dividend will go an enormous way to reinvigorating manufacturing, which is crucial for self-sufficient defence. Tomorrow we will begin looking at Australia's internal threats.